The Horrell Brothers carved a path in Texas and New Mexico, leaving behind dead lawmen, burnt reputations, and communities pushed to the breaking point. Their story is one of cattle theft, broken justice, and men who refused to back down in a world that rewarded aggression. Starting a war in Lincoln County, New Mexico, that earned the name of the Horrell War. They then crossed paths with Higgins, himself forged by frontier violence, turned simmering tension into open war. This is the story of the Horrell Brothers and how their lives helped set the stage for one of the bloodiest eras of the American West. Well, let's get into it, shall we? My name's Steven, and welcome to Wild West Deep Dives. Normally, I like to ease into an episode before the controversy over facts begins, but in this case, the disputes start right at the beginning. There is no serious disagreement that the Horrell family originated in Arkansas, that much is certain. Where things become murky is what happened next. Many sources place the family in Lincoln County, New Mexico, only after their trouble in Lampasas County, Texas, which you will hear later on. Alright, quick disclaimer before we get too far. I know without a shadow of a doubt that I'm probably saying Lampasas wrong. Lampasas. Who knows? Texas has this magical ability to look at a perfectly reasonable spelling and say, nope, we're not going to do that. And honestly, I kind of love it. You can always tell who's a true Texan versus someone who just moved there by how confidently they pronounce town names that make no sense to outsiders. That said, I tried. I really did. I spent a solid 10 minutes researching the correct pronunciation of Lampasas County and somehow found about 7 different correct ways to say it. I'll probably say it 3 or 4 different ways in this episode, so if I butcher a town or county name along the way, just know it's from a place of effort and respect, and mild confusion. Please bear with me. Thank you. Alright, let's get back to the episode. But the record of when they got to Lincoln County doesn't line up that neatly. On the 26th of January, 1869, the Santa Fe Weekly New Mexican reported the killing of a man named Hal at Shed's San Augustine Ranch. Later evidence strongly suggests this victim was actually Samuel Horrell Sr., with a name recorded incorrectly in the paper. Adding to this, James B. Gillette later recalled in his book, 6 Years with the Texas Rangers, and says, quote, "The Horrells were native Texans and had been raised on the frontier. These brothers, of which 5 were involved in the feud, the 6th, John Horrell, had been killed at Las Cruces, New Mexico previously." The feud we will talk about later, but if these accounts are accurate and taken together, they suggest that by the time the Horrell family settled in Lampasas County in 1870, bloodshed was already part of their history, and that at least some of the family lived in New Mexico prior to Lampasas County. At least part of the Horrell family was present in Lampasas County by the 1870 census, in a region overwhelmed by violence. Residing in Lampasas County were 5 of the brothers, Ben, Martin, Merritt, Sam, and Thomas. Indian raids were so severe that the county was exempt from the April 13, 1871 law regulating the carrying of deadly weapons. A company of Minutemen was formed, and the state furnished rifles to its members, among them Ben Horrell and his brother-in-law, Ben Turner. When the brothers came into town, they were described as leading spirits among the fun-loving cowboys who regularly shot at the town, galloping through the streets and firing at knotholes in storefronts. One account notes that the office of White and Gibson alone had 20 or 30 bullets fired through it, while the editor of the Lampasas Dispatch, quote, finally gave up trying to keep glass in his windows. Local law authorities, it was said, were thoroughly cowed. What the Horrell brothers may have been doing beyond their public violence is suggested in one of the few official records to survive. After the Lampasas courthouse burned in 1872, many local files were lost. But a report from Adjutant General and Chief of Police F.L. Britton to Governor Edmund J. Davis accused brothers Thomas, Martin, Merritt, and Ben, along with Ben Turner and numerous associates, of belonging to a gang, quote, whose occupation was the branding, killing, and skinning of other people's cattle. That accusation reveals the deeper fear surrounding the brothers. By the early 1870s, the Horrells were no longer just rowdy cowboys. They were a powerful and dangerous presence, and Lampasas was already living under their shadow. By early 1873, Lampasas County had reached a breaking point. The moment that pushed the town past containment came on the 14th of January during the noon recess of District Court. According to author P.J. Rash in the Horrell War, G.W. Short became disorderly inside Scoot's saloon, and Sheriff Shadrach T. Denson moved to arrest him. As the sheriff attempted to make the arrest, Mark Short physically stepped between them and grappled with Denson, and in the struggle, G.W. Short drew his pistol and shot the sheriff. Judge Turner, hearing Denson's calls for help, ordered a posse under Thomas Sparks to arrest the Shorts, but before the law could act, the Horrell Brothers intervened. Ben, Thomas, and Martin Horrell, along with Patrick Gannitti and companions from the Minutemen, drew their guns and warned the posse that the Shorts were their friends and would be protected. Their stance was so resolute that the lawmen, quote, only watched helplessly as the Shorts rode out of town. With Lampasas effectively ungovernable, county officials appealed directly to Governor Edmund J. Davis. On the 10th of February, Davis issued a proclamation prohibiting the carrying of sidearms in Lampasas County. Adjutant General and Chief of Police F.L. Britton dispatched state police to enforce the new law, but Sergeant J.M. Redmond soon reported that nighttime shooting continued and that citizens were too afraid to swear out warrants, making arrests nearly impossible. Redmond advised that the order could only be restored by stationing about 25 policemen in town or declaring martial law. But funding shortages forced the withdrawal of the troopers, and, just as Redmond predicted, violence surged even worse than before. That failure set the stage for a fatal confrontation at Jerry Scott's saloon. In mid-March, Britain sent Captain Thomas G. Williams and 7 men to Lampasas to enforce the ban on carrying firearms. En route, Williams allegedly told Freighter Tilford Bean that he was going to clean up the Horrell boys, and it was claimed that he had been drinking. This account comes from C.L. Sonicsen's I'll Die Before I'll Run, and it is debated, but it matters because it reflects how Williams' actions later on may have been influenced by drink. What is not disputed is that the police reached Lampasas around 1 p.m. on the 14th of March and halted in front of Jerry Scott's saloon. Inside were 10 to 15 members of the Horrell Circle, including Thomas, Martin, and Merritt Horrell, along with Ben Turner, Joe Bolton, Alan Whitcraft, James Grizzell, Billy Gray, and Jim Jenkins. Most of the Minutemen and much of the town were away attending a trial elsewhere, leaving the saloon unusually isolated. As officers watched from outside, Bill Bowen, Merritt Horrell's brother-in-law, entered the saloon with a pistol hanging on his hip. Captain Williams followed him inside, with Privates Wesley Cherry, T.M. Daniels, and Andrew Melville, placed Bowen under arrest and demanded his revolver. At that moment, Martin Horrell intervened, saying, "Bill, you haven't done any wrong. You don't have to be arrested." According to author P.J. Rash, Williams then attempted to seize Bowen's pistol by force, a move that triggered the gunfight. Williams, Daniels, and Cherry were killed inside the saloon. Melville was struck by a bullet through the left lung and died several days later at the Huling Hotel. Other reports do say that it may have been a month later, but unfortunately, the end was the same. The fight spilled into the street as the Horrell party engaged the remaining troopers outside. Thomas Horrell was shot just below the shoulder blade, and Martin Horrell was hit in the neck. With their captain dead and their force shattering, the surviving lawmen abandoned the field and fled toward Austin. Martin Horrell was carried to his mother's home roughly 200 yards from the saloon, and the rest of the group dispersed from town. In the eyes of the state, this was no longer a riot or a gunfight. It was open war. F.L. Britton arrived in Lampasas on the 17th of March with 12 state policemen and addressed a mass meeting of citizens who pledged cooperation in enforcing the law. With the help of the Lampasas and Burnett Minute companies, Britton scoured 5 counties and eventually arrested Jerry Scott, Martin Horrell, Alan Whitcraft, Jim Jenkins, and James Grizzell, lodging them in the Travis County Jail. Within weeks, Martin Horrell and Jerry Scott were transferred to Georgetown on a writ of habeas corpus, and Mrs. Horrell was allowed to stay in jail to nurse Martin. But on the night of the 2nd of May, 1873, the conflict reached its most brazen moment. About 35 armed men, led by one of the Horrell brothers, rode into Georgetown, warned the citizens that they meant no harm but would free the prisoners at any cost. They exchanged fire with the jail guards until the guards' ammunition ran out. A young lawyer, A.S. Fisher, was seriously wounded. Bill Bowen then smashed the jail door with a sledgehammer, and even 2 prisoners indicted for horse stealing were freed in the chaos. Shortly afterward, the Horrells gathered their cattle, sold what remained, and began moving toward Lincoln County, New Mexico, reportedly notifying the sheriff when they would pass through Russell Gap, and met no resistance. Before Billy the Kid, before the killing of John Tunstall, before the Regulators and the Murphy and Dolan faction, and the shootouts that made Lincoln County famous, there was already blood in the streets. What New Mexico later remembered as the Horrell War unfolded in late 1873 and early 1874, and it left the county divided, terrorized, and primed for the larger conflict that followed. The Horrells settled in the Redolso Valley near present-day Hondo in Lincoln County, a region already dense from racial violence, cattle disputes, and weak civil authority. Author C.L. Sonicson notes that, quote, conflicting tales are told about the beginning of the affair known in New Mexico as the Horrell War, but it's agreed that it was brief and bloody. The immediate spark came on the 1st of December, 1873. Ben Horrell, accompanied by Dave C. Warner and former Lincoln County Sheriff L.J. Gillum, rode into Lincoln on what some sources call business, and others describe plainly as a drinking spree. The men began to drink heavily, became boisterous, and began firing their guns in town. Constable Juan Martinez demanded they surrender their weapons, and they complied, only to secure new arms about an hour later and resume their spree out of Bordello. What happened next is one of the most disputed moments in the entire war. Author P.J. Rash says that as Martinez returned with several members of the police guard and an interpreter named Warwick, Warren suddenly shot Constable Martinez, killing him instantly. Warner was killed in the return fire, but Horrell and Gillum fled, were pursued, wounded, and according to multiple accounts, surrendered before being shot anyway. But author Walter Earl Pittman goes a little further, stating they were, quote, murdered, begging for their lives. And it's possible they were unarmed, even undressed, and their bodies were riddled with bullets. What is consistent across the sources I used is that Ben Horrell and L.J. Gillum died violently at the hands of an Hispanic-led mob, and that the killings were seen by the Horrell family as murder, not lawful enforcement. The Horrells first attempted legal action. They went to Lincoln demanding the arrest and trial of those responsible, but Sheriff Ham Mills refused, siding with the local Hispanic authorities who claimed the police guard had simply been doing its duty. 2 days later, the conflict escalated beyond repair. The bodies of 2 respected Hispanic men were found dead on the Horrell ranch. Sheriff Mills then gathered a posse of roughly 40 men and confronted the Horrells at their ranch on the 5th of December. The Horrells refused to surrender unless their safety and a fair trial could be guaranteed, but that guarantee was never given. Major John L. Mason at Fort Stanton feared a race war, but believed his orders prevented military intervention unless it involved Native Americans. He did, however, send Captain Chambers McGibbon and a detachment of soldiers to observe. Shots were exchanged during the standoff, but no one was killed, and the posse eventually withdrew, likely deterred by the presence of troops. Revenge came 15 days later. On the night of the 20th of December, the Horrells and their allies, 20 to 25 men, rode into Lincoln during a wedding celebration. The gunmen shot out the lights of the adobe building and fired into the crowd. Juan Patron, the man they believe responsible for Ben Horrell's death, was not present. Instead, his father, Isidro Patron, was killed, along with 3 other men, Dario Balazon, Isidro Padilla, and Joe Candelaria. This massacre shocked Lincoln County. Army officers, including Major Mason and ex-sheriff and later again Sheriff William Brady, the same Brady who was later ambushed and killed by the Regulators and Billy the Kid, tried to stabilize the situation, with Mason briefly stationing troops near the plaza, despite lacking legal authority to intervene. Captain James F. Ranlett later wrote that civil law in Lincoln was powerless, enforced only by a lawless posse, and warned that no white citizen would surrender to it except for a barbarous death. By early 1874, the Horrells realized they had no future in Lincoln County. Warrants were issued, posses grew larger, and surrender offered no safety. They gathered their families and began moving back toward Texas, harassing Hispanic communities along the way. One associate of the Horrell family, Edward Little Hart, murdered Deputy Sheriff Joseph Haskins at Picascio. Allegedly, the reason was only because Haskins had an Hispanic wife. About 15 miles west of Roswell, the Texans encountered 5 Hispanic freighters and killed every man. Legends of America estimates that at least 13 Hispanic citizens were killed during the Horrell War of Lincoln County, and author Walter Earl Pittman suggests the total may have reached 29, possibly as high as 75, though that does seem very far-reached. But their journey to Texas was far from over. As they fled, Ben Turner was killed by an ambush shot, possibly fired by a man named Martin Chavez. At one point, the Horrells reportedly recruited as many as 75 cowboys near Roswell and threatened to wipe out Lincoln County entirely, but for reasons still unclear, they turned back. The Horrell War of Lincoln County ended not with justice, but with exhaustion, fear, and flight. Lincoln County was left bitterly divided, its civil authority discredited, and its racial tensions inflamed. Army commanders later admitted that their presence, though officially forbidden from intervening, likely prevented even greater slaughter. In that sense, the Horrell War did not just precede the Lincoln County War, it conditioned the county for it. When John Tunstall was killed a few years later and armed factions once again took to the streets in the Lincoln County War, the citizens already knew exactly how fragile the line between law and bloodshed truly was. When the Horrell brothers finally came back to Lampasas County after the bloodshed in New Mexico, arriving in roughly the end of February 1874, they rode into a community that no longer saw them as rowdy neighbors. Legends of America says they were no longer perceived as a threat, but treated them like outcasts, and that some citizens even took potshots at them as they returned, though no one was killed. Even so, the brothers surrendered to the authorities. They later faced trial for the murder of Captain Thomas Williams, but were ultimately acquitted. After that, they resettled in different pockets of the county. Samuel, north of Lampasas near Sims Creek, Thomas, with property about 7 miles north, and Martin, southeast near the Burnett County line. But waiting in the same county was a man who knew the Horrells well and was not impressed by their reputation. John Pinckney Calhoun Higgins, known to everyone as Pink Higgins. Pink Higgins' background explains why the Horrells had finally met someone as hard as they were. He was born on the 28th of March 1851 in Macon, Georgia, and came to Texas as a small child with his family, who settled in Lampasas County in 1857. According to Kenyon Bennett from True West magazine, Texas state historian Bill O'Neill, whose great-grandfather worked cattle with Pink in the 1870s and 80s, wrote that the Texas frontier would brand Pink a gunslinger by necessity. As a teenager, Pink protected his mother and siblings during the Civil War years amid Comanche raids and livestock theft, while his father served as a private in the Texas state troops. After the war, rustling exploded across the open range, and Pink joined the Law and Order League, which hunted and lynched rustlers. At 18, Pink Higgins personally hanged his first horse thief alone. O'Neill summed up the man this created, quote, "Rustlers who posed a personal threat to Pink and his property would find that they had incurred the enmity of the dangerous man." The Horrells were returning to a county where Pink Higgins had already made himself the kind of enemy you did not outlast. The feud began the way so many frontier wars did: cattle. According to Mrs. Bennett, Pink told Spur Ranch manager Clifford B. Jones that he had grown up with Merritt, Thomas, and Martin Horrell, and even herded cows with them, but that, quote, they began to go wrong. Jones recorded Pink's charge that they would steal a bunch of cattle, then forge a bill of sale. In April 1876, Pink found one of his cows in a herd leaving Lampasas County, and the owner claimed Merritt had sold it to him. Merritt produced the bill of sale and was released. According to a later letter by William R. Wren, a Higgins ally, after they left the court, Pink told Merritt that if he ever stole any other cow of his, he sure would kill him. On the 22nd of January 1877, the feud turned fatal inside a Lampasas saloon. Some sources place it in the Wiley and Toland's Gem Saloon, but others place the confrontation in Jerry Scott's saloon, describing Merritt sitting by a fireplace with a man named Saunders. The location details one of the key contradictions in the record, but the core event is consistent, with Wren giving the clearest version. Pink approached Merritt and said, "Mr. Horrell, this is to settle some cow business," then aimed his Winchester and shot Merritt in the front and killed him, and not in the back. Wren added that Merritt had concealed a 6-shooter and that Saunders testified Merritt attempted to draw it, but Pink got him too quick. To the Higgins faction, it was enforcement, but to the Horrells, it was murder. The Horrell brothers vowed revenge, and within weeks, Lampasas County was in open combat once again. On the 26th of March, 1877, Thomas and Martin Horrell were ambushed 4 miles east of Lampasas by the Higgins party. The ambush happened as Thomas and Martin rode to attend Judge W.A. Blackburn's court, and the attackers were concealed along the creek, now known as Battle Branch. Thomas was knocked out of his saddle and badly hurt. Martin, though hit, dismounted under fire and drove off the attackers single-handedly. When the warrants were issued, Pink Higgins and Bob Mitchell surrendered to Captain John Sparks of the Texas Rangers, posted $10,000 bonds, and were released. Then, on the 4th of June, the Lampasas courthouse was burglarized, and district court records disappeared, including those very bonds. Whether coincidence or a frontier-style cleanup, it removed paper restraints right when both sides were preparing for the next clash. That clash erupted in downtown Lampasas in early June of 1877 and marked the violent peak of the Horrell-Higgins Feud. On the 7th of June, both factions happened to be in town at the same time, and the situation quickly spiraled. Gunfire broke out in the streets, drawing in men from both sides as civilians scrambled for cover. The town square once again became a battlefield, echoing earlier outbreaks of frontier violence that Lampasas seemed unable to escape. Bill Wren, one of Pink Higgins' closest allies, was badly wounded. Frank Mitchell, Bob Mitchell's brother and a cousin of Pink's wife, was killed in the exchange. On the Horrell side, a newcomer to their faction, Jim Buck Miller, was shot dead. As bullets flew, townspeople finally intervened, persuading both sides to break off the fight and leave Lampasas before bloodshed grew even worse. The Texas Rangers were again summoned to prevent the clans from exterminating one another. Major John B. Jones arrived and compelled both factions to submit, ultimately brokering written peace agreements in which each side agreed to regard the feud as, quote, a bygone thing. On paper, the war was over. In reality, Lampasas was left with dead men in its streets, vanished court records, and a sobering lesson on the frontier. The law could end a feud on paper, but it could not undo the violence that had already defined it. Although the feud was officially declared over in 1877, its violence did not truly end there. In 1878, Thomas and Martin Horrell were arrested as suspects in the robbery and murder of J.F. Vaughn, a country storekeeper in southwestern Bosque County. While confined in the Meridian, Texas jail, the two brothers were seized by a vigilante mob that stormed the jail and shot them to death. Some believe the killing was influenced or quietly engineered by members of the Higgins faction, though no evidence ever surfaced to prove it. With Thomas and Martin dead, this served as the real end of the Horrell-Higgins feud, not the written peace agreement brokered by the Texas Rangers. Sam Horrell, the last surviving brother, moved his family out of Texas in 1882 and moved out of state, possibly to Oregon. He would eventually die in California in 1936. Pink Higgins faced his own legal reckoning when, on the 27th of September 1878, a Lampasas court found him not guilty in the killing of Merritt Horrell. He went on to work as a range detective for the Spur Ranch after moving his family to the Spur area in the 1890s. Despite a lifetime marked by gunfire, Pink Higgins was never killed in a shootout. As Spur Ranch manager, Charles Adams Jones later wrote, quote, "In view of the time and the circumstances, one must not be too quick to condemn him. It was either kill or be killed." Pink Higgins died of a heart attack at his home near Spur in December 1913, outliving nearly every man tied to the feud that had once consumed Lampasas County. The lives of the Horrell brothers trace a hard, unforgiving arc across the frontier, one shaped by violence, reputation, and a world where restraint was often mistaken for weakness. They moved through a West defined by cattle theft, racial tension, weak courts, and personal justice enforced at gunpoint. They were feared, hunted, acquitted, and ultimately destroyed not by a single enemy, but by the weight of the lives they lived. One by one, the brothers fell to ambushes, vigilante mobs, and frontier retribution, until only Sam remained, carrying the name far from Texas. The Horrell brothers' story is not just a feud or a series of gunfights. It is a reminder that on the frontier, a reputation could become a destiny, and for the Horrell Brothers, that destiny ended exactly where it began, at the edge of the law. If you enjoy Wild West Deep Dives, please give this video a like and maybe subscribe. If you're listening on Spotify, please give me a rating and follow if you feel so inclined. All this really helps me grow, and I appreciate y'all's support. If y'all haven't checked out the Spotify, please give it a try. I have an 8-part series on both the legendary Lawman Bass Reeves and the Jolly Mountain Man, Joe Meek. Join the membership family. For just $1, you'll get access to bonus content like the Honeywell gunfight and the first stagecoach robbery in U.S. history. And as always, thank you to the membership family. You are noticed and greatly appreciated. We will see y'all next time, and remember, when in doubt, shoot straight, shoot fast. God bless.